Okay, so today I thought we'd actually talk about something that's pretty important that a lot of people don't cover. And again, it is how to stay out of a lawsuit when you are representing a client. So, the number one rule of lawsuits right now, and especially with the economy changing, you're probably going to see people pushing back a little bit more and really taking a look at stuff or cutting corners. Your buyers may be cutting corners and not doing the due diligence or the inspections and relying on you. Now, the first thing you have to remember is what actually, can anyone tell me? What's it say? What's the first word on your license from California? Sales. You're a sales agent. You're not necessarily a commercial real estate expert. It doesn't say that on there. It says you're a sales agent. So you're not an environmental expert. You're not a physical inspector. You are a sales agent. So you have to keep that in mind when you're doing things. Now, the number one area where sales agents get in trouble is when they represent both sides. Okay. So when you're coming in and you're trying to double end the deal, everyone likes to do that. They call it double ending a deal when you're representing both the buyer and the seller. You like to do that because you have double the commission. But the issue that comes up is that you may not be able to represent both parties because, in theory, you have a fiduciary, not in theory, but by law, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your client. And a fiduciary responsibility means that you have to look out for their best interest, their financial interest, just as if they were your own. That can be hard to do if you're representing both the buyer and the seller, meaning you're privy to some information. A seller may say, here's my bottom line, here's the number I want. A buyer may tell you, here's my max price that I'll go to. You can't share that with the other party, nor can you just go to that number necessarily. You are supposed to get the best deal possible. So the easiest way to make sure that there's actually a little bit of a separation is to have another agent. If you're double ending a deal, have another agent represent the buyer, and if you're representing the seller in the negotiations. Okay, so this way you're taking yourself out of the picture. You're still doing it within house and it's still under the brokerage. And you have another agent that comes in and may represent during the negotiations, and you can pay them a referral fee for doing that. And what you decide to pay is entirely up to you. But it is an insurance policy where a buyer can't come back or a seller can't come back and say that you gave them inside information to get a better deal. And therefore, they're going to sue you because of that. So that's one of the methods. It's not necessarily foolproof, 100% foolproof, but you want to also keep notes. Now, generally speaking, this is something to do when we start talking about the transaction side. Notes, notes, notes. Everybody should have notes, whether they're electronic notes, written notes, anything that's going on, but you should also have a timeline of everything that you're doing. One of the areas that you can potentially be sued for a listing is that you're not doing your job getting that listing or representing that listing, getting it out into the marketplace, getting it leased up or getting it sold. So what you want to do is also keep track of everything that you've done for that listing. Everything from, we took the listing on this day, we put it into CoStar, LoopNet, Crexi, MLS, any other data sources that you may have on this day, you write it down. And then you also start talking about and looking at the contacts. How many people have contacted you through that? Write those down, the phone numbers, the names, the people, and who you have contacted. So it shows a track record of everything that you've done for that listing to either get it leased up or sold. So you're supposed to actually keep under California law, keep a note, a timeline for everything. So, one of the easiest ways I found to do that is to just attach a sheet of paper to the back of one of the inside of the folders and put your notes down there. Everything that you've done, everything that you're doing for the property, when you did it, what the responses are, and also what the feedback is. So when you get the feedback, you're also then able to give the feedback to your client. Okay. The other area that a lot of people get tied up into or in lawsuits is by saying something that may not necessarily be true, but you think is true. Okay. This is where the biggest thing I can say to keep yourself out of a lawsuit is do not assume. Unless you have actual knowledge, then you really don't know. So don't assume that you know something. I've seen this happen a lot of times where an agent may want to try and uh, appear more valuable to their client. They walk through a property, and they can sit there and say, "Oh, well, there's a crack up there on the wall and some stains, but that's nothing. It's just a stress crack." You really don't know that, okay? So you can't say those things. When you're going through, and if for some reason the state's requiring you to do an inspection, it's a visual inspection. They're not requiring you to turn on the HVAC, making sure it's working. They're not requiring you to check the systems, the plumbing, if there's any clogs or things like that. You're doing a physical inspection. You're just walking through and you're noting things that you may see that may be off or may not be correct. You are not supposed to go any further into the investigations, and that's where a lot of agents make a mistake, because they're trying to make themselves appear a little bit more valuable to the client. So they go in and they'll say, you don't, or they'll, worse yet, they'll say, no, you don't need that inspection. I don't think you need it. Really what you're doing is, if someone were to ask, the best response, if someone says, well, should I get an environmental report, is not a yes or a no. It's an explanation of what the environmental report is and what it does, and then ask them if they feel that it's necessary to get for their needs. Now, granted, if they're getting financing, they're probably going to be required to get an environmental report, but a lot of times they may be paying cash. So whenever someone asks you if they should get a report or an inspection done on a property, you should phrase things in, well, here typically the typical inspections most buyers get. Okay, here's what they mean and here's what they are. It's up to you if you decide that you want to move forward and get these inspections. We highly recommend that you have professional inspectors inspect, so that you have someone that you can rely on, or the buyer has someone they can rely on and come back to if there are any mistakes that are made in the reports. So the bottom line, though, is you don't want to be the one making that report or making those inspections. That's not your job. You are a sales agent, okay, or a broker. You're not an inspector, so don't do the inspections. The other thing, especially, and this is actually, you see this happen a little bit more with either on the younger agent side, you see them trying to analyze a purchase agreement or a lease document, and they may not understand the full legal liabilities of a change or one change, and they can just say, oh, that's fine. Realistically, though, just changing one word in a document or adding one word in a document can completely change that clause in that paragraph. So unless you're an attorney and you're being paid to do legal work for this transaction, don't do any legal work. You're going above and beyond. You cannot give legal advice. So legal advice would be you can explain terms, what they mean, what they are, but you can't give legal advice in the sense of, I'm going to, change this sentence to this and that and move this around. That's not your job. That's a job for the attorney, for the buyer or the seller to do. But there's a lot of times where that is taken in, and even agents that are very experienced, because they've had so much experience in negotiating, sometimes they may come in and say, oh, well, we're going to change this in the lease and ask for this. Well, they're really acting as an attorney at that point. Don't do that. Understand what your job is and just stick to that wheelhouse, stick to that, to what you're supposed to be doing, and make sure that everybody else is doing their job. And, again, if you remember from the other classes, part of what we are saying for all the agents is that you guys are kind of like the hub of a wheel, where all the vendors, the attorneys, the escrow, the title, the inspectors are all reporting or talking to you and speaking to you and let you know what's going on. So this way you can actually convey that information back and forth. But you want to make sure everyone's doing their job and that you're not doing it for them. Because when you start doing their job for them, you're stepping past the bounds and going further and opening yourself up to liability. Okay. The other area where a agent can get themselves in trouble a lot of times is by passing along information that is not unfounded at this time. Third-party information, and we see this a lot. You may have a nosy neighbor come by and say, oh, did you know that back in 1978, this was a mass murder history site with this. Okay, first of all, you shouldn't be going around telling your client that or any client that, because it's hearsay. It's third-party information. The previous tenant used to run a meth lab in this property. We don't know that. You can't pass that along. It may open the door to investigate further, but you don't want to start looking into it and saying, oh, well, it was a meth lab before. We don't know that, because you know what? Now you're opening yourself potentially up to liability if you're on the buy side. They end up getting more inspections or whatever, and it's just somebody, maybe a neighbor that doesn't want the sale to happen. You don't know what their motives are. Okay, so you may end up costing your client more money, or even the deal. They may end up backing out of the deal and find out that, you know what, it really wasn't true, but you're the one who conveyed what was true. Okay, so hearsay is a huge issue when it comes to that, and you have to understand what is hearsay and what is fact and what is truth. So, if it's something that should have been known, then that can bear further investigation, okay? As opposed to something that, there's no way of knowing, but it's hearsay. They just said, when they remodeled this property, they hired a contractor and they didn't pull any permits. And they did shoddy work, or something like that. Well, you can look into it. You can have your client pull permits and find out if the permits were pulled. But at the same time, it's not up to you to say that, oh, this is unpermitted work. That's hearsay. Until you have evidence, you can't say that it is, okay? Which goes to the next item. A lot of agents want to try and help out their client, and they understand that time kills deals, so they want to move that deal forward. And a lot of times they'll go and they'll do something like go to the city and ask, especially on a development deal. We're looking at acquiring, or I'm looking at selling this property. Can we develop this and the buyer's looking to develop this 30-unit apartment building. Can they do that here? Or whatever it may be. That's not your job to do. That's the buyer's job. And the reason why it's not your job to do is you're relying, again, on a third party to give you information that they're not going to, write it down. They're not going to say, I, George Pino, work for the city of Los Angeles, and say that you can build 30 units. No, they're going to say that potentially you could build upwards of 30 units, but until it's actually permitted, processed, and stamped for approval, it's not done. But if you convey that to a client that, oh yeah, I spoke to XYZ person at the city and they said that you can do this at this property. The zoning allows for this, whatever it may be, okay? If you run into that situation, the problem is, one, that city inspector is not going to remember talking to you, okay? Two, you don't have anything in writing, so there's nothing backing it up. So all you're doing is putting yourself out there and adding liability to what you're doing. You should not be pulling permits. You should not be going and talking to the city ever. They have special vendors that will do that. They have expediters that can research it. They have property zoning reports that they can order. They have all types of things that they can get. If your client doesn't want to do that, that doesn't mean you need to do that or should do that. In fact, exact opposite. You should not be going down to the city at any time to determine if a specific property that your client's acquiring fits the needs. Okay, and again, that goes back to something we talked about with zoning. One of the things that we have to remember is that most cities have a general zoning, which covers everything, but they also have what they call overlays. So especially larger cities. So certain areas may have overlays that may affect the zoning, and even if the zoning allows for the specific use, the overlay may not. So, which is why we do not go out and we do not say that, you know what, you can do this with this zoning. It's up to the buyer to take a look at it. Now, how does that translate into what you should be doing also to keep yourself out of a lawsuit? Number one, when you're conveying, you know, if a client asks me, you know, is the zoning allowed, or is this use allowed in this zoning? I can attach the city zoning report and say, here are all the uses that are allowed. It appears that your use is specifically allowed by the city. However, there may be overlays that you want to look into that may cause issues, overlays or perhaps even parking issues that may cause problems with getting this zoning. You may have to apply for a CUP or a variance, but you should speak to the city for that. Okay? Always defer to someone else that's the actual expert that can do it. Never give answers in hard, like you absolutely have to do this, or it truly is this, because the fact is, commercial real estate or real estate in general is not black and white. There are a lot of grays when it comes to the zoning issues and other issues with the property or acquiring it and things like that. So always bear that in mind. And if you do, understand that don't speak in definitive, final type statements, but open-ended. You know, you should be able to, as opposed to you will be able to, open statements. Things like that, using the words approximately when we're talking about size, because unless you've actually measured it and know how it was measured, you don't have it, or you can qualify it out. Lastly is, you know, we shouldn't be taking any instructions verbally from a client. It should always be in writing, preferably not via text. Some states may allow text, some states do not allow text messages yet as backup, because you can easily modify or change text messages. So make sure though that you get an instruction. If for some reason though your client doesn't give you instructions, you know, maybe they're traveling, they're out of the area, but they tell you verbally to do something, it's time sensitive, follow up with a self-serving email saying, this is to confirm our conversation that we had at 11 a.m. that you want me to do this. I will be reaching out and ordering this, or doing whatever it is. Send that email out and make sure you file it. This should also be part of your notation, because you're going to have in your notes in your book that I spoke to them at 11 a.m. and then this is what you did afterwards. So if you do all these steps, you will be protected. I can't guarantee no one will ever sue you, because people can sue for whatever they want, but you should be pretty well protected from actually losing a lawsuit or even getting yourself into that situation. So bear that in mind, and I think if take that approach, you should be good. Okay?